Dr. Alex Carter adjusted the sterile mask over his nose, the fabric scratchy and uncomfortable against his skin. The research facility loomed ahead, a stark white beacon of scientific progress nestled in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. The remote location ensured privacy and containment, crucial for the kind of work they did here. As he approached the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been gnawing at him since he boarded the helicopter. The vast expanse of icy tundra was unsettling, a reminder of just how isolated they were from the rest of the world. The sterile, cold interior of the facility did little to calm his nerves. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow on the pristine white walls. He made his way through the labyrinthine corridors, each turn bringing him closer to the lab where his latest project awaited. Morning, Dr. Carter, a young technician, greeted him, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. Morning, he replied, forcing a smile. The usual hum of activity seemed subdued, a faint undercurrent of tension that was hard to place. In the lab, the usual suspects were already gathered around the containment chamber. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective breath held in suspense. Dr. Carter joined them, his eyes fixed on the small, glass-walled enclosure at the center of the room. "Anything new?" he asked, his voice betraying his curiosity. "Just came in," said Dr. Patel, his colleague and friend, handing over a tablet loaded with the latest data. "This one's different. We found it in a deep-sea vent, unlike anything we've seen before." Dr. Carter scanned the information, his brow furrowing. The microorganism displayed characteristics that were odd. It seemed to exhibit some form of sentience, responding to stimuli in ways that defied conventional understanding. "Have you run the usual tests?" Carter asked, his fingers dancing over the screen as he pulled up more data. "Yes, and the results are." "Well, you need to see for yourself." Carter stepped closer to the containment chamber, peering inside. The microorganism was almost invisible to the naked eye, a faint shimmer against the backdrop of the sterile environment. He watched as it pulsated rhythmically, a living, breathing entity in its own right. "Increase the stimulus," he ordered, eyes never leaving the chamber. A technician adjusted the controls, and the environment within the chamber shifted. The organism reacted immediately, its movements more deliberate, almost as if it was aware of their presence. "Fascinating," Carter muttered, a mix of intrigue and unease bubbling within him. "It's like it's trying to communicate." The room fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. The air was thick with the unknown, the eerie sense that they were standing on the precipice of a discovery that could change everything. "Document every reaction," Carter said finally, his voice steady but his mind racing. "We need to understand what we're dealing with here." As the day wore on, the feeling of unease only grew. The more they probed, the more the microorganism seemed to respond, almost as if it was studying them in return. Carter couldn't shake the sense that they had stumbled upon something far beyond their understanding, something that defied the very nature of life itself. He left the lab late that night, the icy wind biting at his cheeks as he stepped outside. The sky above was a vast expanse of darkness, dotted with distant stars that seemed indifferent to the mysteries unfolding below. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread. Something was different about this organism, something that set it apart from all the others they had encountered. As he made his way to his quarters, the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him, whispering secrets he was not yet ready to hear. And deep within the lab, the microorganism pulsed rhythmically, its sentient awareness growing stronger with each passing moment. Dr. Alex Carter sat in the dimly lit lab, the hum of the containment chamber the only sound breaking the silence. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface slightly. The organism inside was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a shimmering entity that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was hard to shake the unsettling feeling it provoked, but his scientific curiosity pushed him to learn more. The screen next to him flickered with data, streams of numbers and graphs detailing the microorganism's responses to various stimuli. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers tapping out commands on the touchscreen, refining the parameters of the next test. Dr. Carter, a voice called softly from behind him. He turned to see Dr. Patel, her face a mixture of excitement and concern. "We have some new data." Patel handed him a tablet, her fingers lingering for a moment, as if she was reluctant to part with the device. Carter glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he took in the information. "It's evolving," Patel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's adapting to everything we throw at it." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. The organism's ability to change and respond was not just fascinating, it was disquieting. He'd never encountered a microorganism with such a pronounced and rapid adaptive capability. "Let's run the neural stimulus test," Carter suggested, trying to mask his unease with professionalism. "I want to see how it reacts to simulated neural activity." Patel nodded and moved to the control panel. Carter watched as the environment within the containment chamber shifted, tiny electrodes sending faint pulses of energy towards the microorganism. It responded immediately, shimmering more brightly and moving in a way that suggested it was following the energy pulses. "It's like it's aware," Patel murmured, her eyes wide. "Almost like it's trying to understand us." Carter's mind raced. Sentience in microorganisms was unheard of, a concept that blurred the lines between biology and something far more complex. He leaned in closer, studying the organism's reactions, each movement calculated, deliberate. "We need to be careful," he said finally. "Document every response, every change. This could be a groundbreaking discovery, but we need to understand it fully before we proceed." The lab was silent, except for the faint hum of machinery and the occasional tap of fingers on screens. Carter felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The microorganism's behavior was intriguing, but there was an underlying sense of menace in its deliberate responses. Hours passed as they conducted test after test, each one revealing more about the organism's capabilities. It seemed to grow more active, more responsive, almost as if it was learning from their experiments. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, studied in return. "Take a break, Patel," he finally said, noticing the fatigue on his colleague's face. "I'll monitor the next few tests." Patel nodded, her eyes lingering on the containment chamber as she left the room. Carter settled into his chair, his eyes fixed on the organism. The lab felt colder, the shadows longer, as if the room itself was reacting to the presence of this strange, sentient entity. He activated the next test, watching as the organism responded with a series of complex movements, its shimmering form almost hypnotic. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. This discovery was monumental, but it was also deeply unsettling. As the night wore on, Carter's mind buzzed with possibilities. What if this organism wasn't just sentient but intelligent? What if it had its own motives, its own plans? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the faint flicker of light on the screen, a brief but intense pulse that matched the rhythm of the organism's movements. It was as if the microorganism was communicating, sending out a signal. Carter blinked, focusing on the screen. The data was there, clear as day. The organism was trying to communicate. His heart raced as he realized the implications. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a revelation. He typed a quick note into his log, his hands shaking slightly. The organism's sentience was no longer just a possibility, it was a reality. And as he watched it pulse and shimmer in its containment chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had unlocked something far more significant and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The lab felt darker, the air heavier with each passing moment. Carter knew they were on the brink of a monumental discovery, but at what cost? The unease in his gut told him that they were delving into something that could change everything, something that might be better left undisturbed. The lab was quiet, the kind of eerie silence that settled deep into the bones and refused to let go. Dr. Alex Carter stood by the containment chamber, his eyes fixed on the organism within. It had been 3 days since they had discovered its sentient capabilities, and each day brought with it a deeper layer of unsettling behaviors. "Patel, come look at this," Carter called out, his voice tinged with a hint of nervous excitement. Dr. Patel hurried over, her expression mirroring his unease. The microorganism was no longer just responding to stimuli, it was mimicking them. Patterns of light and pulses of energy had become its language, and it was communicating in ways that defied their understanding. "It's like it's learning," Patel said, her voice hushed. "Adapting to our tests and then replicating them." Carter nodded, his mind racing. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Sentience was one thing, but this level of mimicry and adaptation suggested an intelligence that was far more advanced than they had anticipated. "Run the cognitive simulation," he instructed, his eyes never leaving the chamber. "I want to see how it handles more complex patterns." Patel hesitated for a moment before complying. The screen flickered as the simulation began, sending intricate patterns of light and sound into the chamber. The organism responded immediately, its movements more deliberate, more purposeful. It was almost as if it was thinking, processing the information and then reacting. It's solving the puzzles," Patel whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How is that even possible?" Carter felt a chill run down his spine. The organism was not just sentient, it was intelligent, capable of complex thought and problem-solving. He watched as it completed the simulation, its shimmering form pulsating with a rhythm that seemed almost triumphant. "We need to document this," he said, his voice steady despite the growing unease. "Every reaction, every response. This could change everything we know about microbial life." As they continued their tests, the organism's behavior became increasingly unsettling. It began to anticipate their actions, reacting before the stimuli were even fully applied. It was as if it could sense their intentions, its responses growing more complex and coordinated. "Alex," Patel said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think it's trying to communicate with us." Carter looked at her, his own unease mirrored in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Look at the patterns," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's repeating certain sequences, almost like a message." He stared at the data, the rhythmic pulses and shimmering movements forming a pattern that was unmistakable. The organism was indeed trying to communicate, but what was it saying? "We need to decipher this," Carter said, his mind racing. "If we can understand its language, maybe we can figure out what it wants." Hours turned into days as they worked to decode the patterns. The lab took on a haunting atmosphere, the dim lights casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The organism's presence was palpable, an unseen force that weighed heavily on their minds. Late one night, as Carter pored over the data, a sudden realization hit him. The patterns were not just random sequences, they were mimicking human neural activity. The organism was trying to understand them, to communicate in a way that bridged the gap between its existence and theirs. "Patel, look at this," he called out, his voice tinged with both excitement and fear. "It's replicating our neural patterns. It's trying to think like us." Patel stared at the screen, her face pale. "What does that mean?" "It means," Carter said slowly, "that this organism is far more advanced than we ever imagined. It's not just sentient, it's intelligent, and it's trying to connect with us." The implications were staggering. This was not just a microorganism, it was a new form of life, one that defied the very boundaries of biology and consciousness. As they continued their work, the feeling of unease grew stronger, an almost tangible presence that filled the lab. Carter couldn't shake the sense that they were delving into something far beyond their understanding. The organism's behavior was both fascinating and terrifying, a glimpse into a world that was both alien and eerily familiar. And as he watched the organism pulse and shimmer in its containment chamber, he couldn't help but feel that they were standing on the brink of a discovery that could change everything, if it didn't destroy them first. The lab was a fortress of steel and glass, designed to keep the world outside safe from whatever horrors they unearthed. But as Dr. Alex Carter stood before the containment chamber, the alarms blaring around him, he realized their precautions might not be enough. Red lights flashed in rhythmic bursts, casting sinister shadows that danced across the walls. A siren wailed, its piercing sound slicing through the air, creating a backdrop of chaos that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside Carter's mind. "Containment breach," Patel shouted over the noise, her voice tinged with panic. "It's breached containment." Carter's heart pounded in his chest. The microorganism had evolved faster than they could have anticipated, its intelligence growing with each passing moment. Now, it had found a way out, slipping through the microscopic cracks in their defenses. "Seal off the lab," Carter ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We need to contain it here." Technicians scrambled to follow his command, their movements frantic and desperate. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. Carter moved to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he initiated the lockdown sequence. Steel shutters clanged shut over the windows, and heavy doors sealed with a resounding thud. "Status report," he demanded, turning to face the team. Patel's eyes were wide with fear, her face pale. "It's spreading through the air ducts," she said, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "We've lost containment in sections B and C." Carter's mind raced. The organism was airborne, a scenario they had feared but hoped to avoid. He had to think fast to stay one step ahead of the sentient threat that now prowled through their facility. "Everyone, respirators on," he shouted, donning his own mask. "We need to isolate the affected areas. Patel, get the decontamination protocols running. We can't let this spread any further." As the team moved to follow his orders, Carter felt a surge of determination. They had come too far to let this discovery turn into a catastrophe. He had to find a way to stop the microorganism, to contain the breach before it reached the outside world. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and fear. Carter moved through the corridors, his mind focused on the task at hand. He reached Section B, the epicenter of the breach, and his heart sank. The shimmering, sentient organism clung to the walls and air vents, pulsating with an eerie, malevolent light. "Patel, we need more containment units," he said into his comms, his voice tight. "We have to isolate it here before it spreads any further." The lab's usual sterile order was replaced by a chaotic, nightmarish landscape. Carter's breath echoed in his mask, the sound a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in every corner. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning for any sign of the organism. A sudden movement caught his attention, and he turned just in time to see a technician collapse, the microorganism swarming over them in a shimmering wave. Carter's stomach churned with horror as he watched, helpless to intervene. "Seal off Section B," he ordered, his voice hollow. "We've lost too many already." As the doors sealed shut, cutting off the infected area, Carter felt a pang of guilt and sorrow. These were his colleagues, his friends, and he had to leave them behind to save the rest of the facility. He returned to the control room, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. The breach was contained, but the organism was still inside, still a threat. They had bought themselves some time, but the battle was far from over. "Alex," Patel said, her voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Carter looked at her, his resolve hardening. "We find a way to neutralize it. We can't let this thing reach the outside world." The air was thick with tension, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. As Carter prepared for the next phase of their desperate fight, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only just beginning to understand the true extent of the danger they faced. And deep within the sealed-off sections, The microorganism pulsed with a sinister intelligence, plotting its next move. The facility had become a fortress of fear. Every door locked, every corridor sealed, and the only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the occasional, muffled cries of those trapped in the quarantined sections. Dr. Alex Carter stood at the central control station, his eyes darting between monitors that displayed real-time data and live feeds from security cameras. "Quarantine protocols are fully engaged," Patel reported, her voice echoing through the tense silence of the control room. "We've isolated sections B and C, but the organism is still active in the air ducts. We need to find a way to purge it from the system." Carter nodded, his jaw set in grim determination. "We'll have to use the high-heat sterilization process. It's risky, but it's our best shot at neutralizing the airborne spores." The weight of their situation pressed heavily on Carter's shoulders. They were locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the sentient microorganism that was growing more intelligent by the minute. The facility felt like a labyrinthine tomb, every corner potentially harboring the shimmering threat. "Begin the heat sterilization," Carter ordered. "Make sure everyone is clear of the affected sections." Patel's fingers flew over the keyboard, initiating the sequence. A low hum reverberated through the control room as the system powered up, the temperature in the quarantined sections beginning to rise. Carter watched the monitors, his eyes narrowing as he saw the organism's movements become more erratic, almost as if it was aware of their efforts to destroy it. "It's reacting to the heat," Patel said, her voice tense. "But it's not retreating. It's clustering, forming denser colonies." Carter's heart sank. The organism was adapting once again, finding new ways to survive their attempts to eradicate it. He clenched his fists, the feeling of helplessness almost overwhelming, but he couldn't afford to give in to despair. "Increase the temperature," he said, his voice steady. "We need to push it to its limits." As the temperature continued to climb, the air in the control room grew thicker, with tension. The organism's colonies began to shimmer more intensely, the light reflecting off the screens like malevolent stars in a dark sky. "Alex," Patel said quietly, "we're getting close to the structural limits of the facility. If we push much further, we could cause a breach." Carter took a deep breath, weighing the risks. "We have no choice. We can't let it spread. Increase the temperature and prepare for structural reinforcements. We'll deal with the aftermath once the organism is contained." Patel nodded, her face pale but resolute. The hum of the sterilization system grew louder, the heat intensifying. Sweat beaded on Carter's forehead as he watched the monitors, his eyes burning with concentration. Suddenly the lights flickered, and a series of alarms began to blare. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he saw the organism making a desperate move, spreading rapidly through the ducts, seeking cooler areas to escape the heat. "Redirect power to containment doors," Carter shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "We can't let it reach the lower levels." Technicians scrambled to comply, their movements frantic. The facility shuddered as doors slammed shut, isolating sections in a desperate bid to contain the spread. Carter's mind raced, trying to stay one step ahead of the sentient threat. In the chaos, a technician stumbled, her respirator slipping from her face. Carter watched in horror as the organism surged towards her, shimmering tendrils reaching out like grasping hands. "No," he shouted, but it was too late. The technician screamed as the organism engulfed her, the sound echoing through the control room. Carter's heart pounded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He forced himself to focus, to push the horror aside. "Seal off Section D," he ordered, his voice trembling but determined. "We can't let it spread any further." The doors sealed with a resounding thud, cutting off the screams and the sight of the shimmering horror. The control room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the labored breathing of the survivors. Carter leaned against the control panel, his mind reeling. They had managed to contain the immediate threat, but at a terrible cost. The facility was a maze of sealed doors and quarantine sections, a fragile barrier against the relentless, sentient organism that lurked within. "We need a new plan," he said, his voice hoarse. "The heat sterilization isn't enough. We need to find a way to outsmart it, to hit it where it's vulnerable." Patel looked at him, her eyes filled with determination and fear. "We'll find a way, Alex. We have to." As the facility settled into an uneasy silence, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were only delaying the inevitable. The organism was still out there, still adapting, still plotting its next move. And as he stared at the monitors, the shadows seemed to grow longer, the air thicker with the sense of impending doom. The quiet had become a heavy, oppressive blanket over the facility. Dr. Alex Carter stood in the dimly lit corridor, the shadows stretching long and ominous along the walls. The hum of the containment units and the distant, muffled sounds of the sterilization systems were the only signs of life. It was a deceptive calm, a fragile peace that threatened to shatter at any moment. "Status update," Carter said into his comms, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. Patel's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Sections B and C are stable, but the organism is still active. We've managed to contain it, but it's adapting faster than we can counter." Carter closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of their situation pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the stakes they faced. "Keep monitoring. We need to find a weakness, something we can exploit." He moved through the corridor, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. He reached the central lab, where a small team of technicians and scientists were gathered around the control panels, their faces tense and focused. "Any progress?" Carter asked, stepping into the room. One of the technicians, a young woman named Lisa, looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "We're trying to decode its communication patterns, but it's like it's one step ahead of us." Carter nodded, his jaw set in grim determination. "Keep at it. We can't afford to fall behind." Suddenly, a series of alarms blared, the harsh sound cutting through the air like a knife. Carter's heart raced as he turned to the monitor, seeing the red flashing indicators of a breach. "Section D," Patel's voice came through, tight with panic. "We have a containment breach in Section D." Carter's blood ran cold. He grabbed a respirator from the wall and strapped it on, his movements swift and precise. "Everyone, gear up. We're moving out." The team moved quickly, donning their protective gear and arming themselves with containment tools. Carter led the way, his mind focused on the task at hand. They couldn't afford to lose another section, not now. As they approached Section D, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The lights flickered, casting ghostly images on the walls. Carter's grip tightened on his containment tool, his senses on high alert. They reached the sealed door, the red warning lights casting an ominous glow. Carter swiped his access card, and the door slid open with a hiss. The corridor beyond was dark, the air thick with tension. "Move in," Carter ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. They moved as one, a tight formation of bodies and focused minds. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and sharp. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as they rounded a corner, the dim light revealing a sight that froze him in his tracks. A technician lay on the floor, her body convulsing as the shimmering, sentient organism swarmed over her. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Carter's stomach churned with horror as he realized who it was. "Lisa," he shouted, rushing forward. Patel grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Alex, no, it's too late." Carter watched, helpless, as the organism engulfed her, its shimmering tendrils pulsing with a malevolent light. Lisa's body went still, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the containment units. "Seal off this area," Carter said, his voice hollow. "We can't let it spread any further." Patel nodded, her face pale. The team moved quickly, sealing the doors and initiating the containment protocols. Carter stood over Lisa's body, his heart heavy with sorrow and guilt. "We're losing this fight," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the shimmering tendrils of the organism. "We need to find a way to stop it before it takes any more of us." Patel placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch a small comfort in the face of their overwhelming fear. "We'll find a way, Alex. We have to." As they turned to leave, Carter took one last look at Lisa's lifeless form. The weight of their situation pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the cost of their discovery. The organism was still out there, still adapting, still a threat. And as they moved through the dark, silent corridors of the facility, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The organism was intelligent, malevolent, and relentless. It was only a matter of time before it found a way to break free once again. The shadows seemed to close in around them, the air heavy with the scent of fear and death. Carter's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to outsmart the sentient threat that lurked in the darkness. But as the alarms continued to blare and the facility shuddered under the strain, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a losing battle. The organism was evolving, growing stronger with each passing moment. And the cost of their failure was becoming all too clear. The facility was descending into chaos. Dr. Alex Carter moved through the dimly lit corridors, the emergency lights casting an eerie red glow that made every shadow seem alive. The alarms were a constant, deafening presence, their wailing punctuated by the distant sounds of struggle and panic. "Alex, we've got another breach in Section E," Patel's voice crackled through his earpiece, tight with fear and exhaustion. "Seal it off," Carter replied, his voice grim. "We can't let it spread any further." The organism was relentless, adapting faster than they could contain it. Every time they sealed off an area, it found another way to breach their defenses. The facility, once a beacon of scientific progress, had become a labyrinth of fear and desperation. Carter rounded a corner, his respirator tight against his face, and nearly collided with a group of panicked technicians. Their eyes were wide with terror, their movements frantic as they tried to escape the invisible threat. "Get to the secure zones," he ordered, his voice cutting through their panic. "Stay together and follow the quarantine protocols." They nodded, their fear palpable, and hurried down the corridor. Carter watched them go, a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew that many of them wouldn't make it. The organism was too pervasive, too cunning. He moved on, his mind racing. They needed a new plan, something to turn the tide. The organism was winning, spreading through the facility like wildfire, and their attempts to contain it were failing. "Patel," he said into his comms, "meet me in the central lab. We need to come up with a new strategy." The central lab was a hive of activity, the remaining staff working frantically to analyze the organism's behavior and find a weakness. Carter joined Patel at the main console, her face drawn with fatigue. "We can't keep sealing off sections," she said, her voice shaky. "It's only a matter of time before it breaches the final containment zone." Carter nodded, his mind working through the possibilities. "We need to hit it where it's most vulnerable. If we can disrupt its ability to communicate and coordinate, we might be able to slow it down." Patel looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "How do we do that?" Carter pulled up the data on the screen, the complex patterns of the organism's communication filling the display. "It's using a form of bioelectric signaling to coordinate its movements. If we can create an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to disrupt those signals, we might be able to buy ourselves some time." "It's risky," Patel said, her brow furrowing. "An EMP that strong could knock out our own systems as well." "We don't have a choice," Carter replied, determination hardening his voice. "It's a risk we have to take." They set to work, the lab buzzing with frantic energy as they prepared the EMP. Every second counted, the organism's relentless advance pressing down on them. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight that made every breath feel like a struggle. "EMP is ready," Patel said finally, her voice tight with nerves. "We just need to activate it." Carter nodded, his heart pounding. "Do it." Patel activated the EMP, the hum of power building to a crescendo. The lights flickered, and for a moment it felt like the whole facility held its breath. Then, with a blinding flash, the pulse was released. The immediate effect was disorienting. The lights dimmed, the alarms silenced, and the screens went dark. For a few heart-stopping moments there was nothing but silence and darkness. Then, slowly, the backup systems kicked in, emergency lights casting a dim, flickering glow. Carter looked around, his heart in his throat. Had it worked? "Alex," Patel said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. "Look." The organism's presence on the monitors was diminishing, its bioelectric signals disrupted by the EMP. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. "We've bought ourselves some time," Carter said, relief flooding through him. "Now we need to use it." But even as he spoke, he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The organism was relentless, and it would find a way to adapt. They had to stay one step ahead to find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. The facility was still a battleground, every corridor and room a potential death trap. And as Carter looked around at the faces of his team, he knew the fight was far from over. The organism was still out there, still adapting, still a threat. The chaos had been momentarily abated, but the true battle was just beginning. And in the dim, flickering light of the lab, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something even more catastrophic. The facility lay in a tenuous silence, the flickering emergency lights casting long, sinister shadows along the corridors. Dr. Alex Carter moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He couldn't shake the ominous feeling that clung to him, like a predator's eyes watching from the darkness. "Patel, are you there?" Carter spoke into his calm, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Here, Alex," came the reply, strained but steady. "We're in the secondary lab. We found something. You need to see this." Carter quickened his pace, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The secondary lab was on the lower levels, a place they rarely needed to use. As he descended, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the silence more oppressive. He entered the lab to find Patel and a small team huddled around a console. Their faces were illuminated by the eerie glow of the monitor, their expressions a mixture of horror and disbelief. "What did you find?" Carter asked, moving to join them. Patel looked up, her eyes haunted. "It's the organism's origin. We've managed to decode part of its genetic structure, and it's not from here." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the screen, where complex genetic sequences were displayed. "It's not Earth-based. The structure, the coding, it's extraterrestrial. And there's more. This organism wasn't just randomly sent here. It was designed, engineered with a purpose." Carter stared at the screen, his mind reeling. "Engineered? By whom?" "We don't know," Patel replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the data suggests it was created as a weapon, a biological entity meant to adapt and overcome any environment." The implications were staggering. This was not just a natural phenomenon, but an intentional act, a deliberate threat sent to Earth. Carter's mind raced, trying to comprehend the scale of what they were dealing with. "Look at this," another scientist, Dr. Morris, said, drawing Carter's attention to another part of the screen. "There's more in the genetic code. It's like a message, a signature." Carter leaned in, squinting at the display. A signature. Yes, Morris replied. It's as if whoever engineered this wanted to leave a mark, a way to trace it back to its origin. But it's encoded, layered beneath the organism's primary functions. As they worked to decode the hidden message, the atmosphere in the lab grew even more tense. The air was thick with the weight of their discovery, each revelation bringing more questions than answers. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer. Finally, the screen flashed with new data. They had decoded part of the message, and what it revealed sent a shiver through Carter's entire being. It's a warning, Patel said, her voice trembling. It says, the first wave. Prepare for assimilation. Carter felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The organism was not just a random attack, but the precursor to something far worse. This is just the beginning, he murmured. There's more coming. The realization hit them all at once. The organism's relentless adaptation, its intelligence, its engineered nature, all pointed to a larger, more sinister plan, and they were only scratching the surface. We need to get this information out, Carter said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. The world needs to know what's coming. But how? Patel asked, desperation creeping into her voice. We're barely holding this thing at bay. If we try to leave, it could spread beyond the facility. We have to try, Carter replied. We can't keep this contained forever. We need to warn the others, to prepare for what's coming. As they began to formulate a plan, the facility shuddered, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the halls. The organism was still out there, still adapting, still a threat. Carter looked at his team, their faces pale but determined. We've faced worse odds before. We'll find a way. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. The organism was evolving, learning from their every move. And as the shadows deepened and the air grew colder, he knew they were racing against an enemy far beyond their understanding. The message had been clear: this was just the beginning. And as they prepared for the next phase of their desperate struggle, Carter couldn't help but wonder what horrors the second wave would bring. The facility, once a beacon of scientific hope, had become a battleground for the very survival of humanity. And in the darkness, the organism pulsed with a malevolent intelligence, its plans unfolding with every beat. The weight of their discoveries hung over the team like a dark cloud as they gathered in the central lab. Dr. Alex Carter looked around at the weary faces of his colleagues. They had been through hell, but the fight was far from over. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. All right, listen up, Carter said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. We know what we're dealing with now. This organism is a weapon, and more are coming. We need to stop it here and now, or humanity won't stand a chance. Patel stepped forward, her eyes burning with determination. We've managed to isolate part of the organism's neural network. If we can disrupt it, we might be able to neutralize its intelligence. How do we do that? Dr. Morris asked, skepticism edging his voice. We create a feedback loop, Patel replied. Overload its neural pathways, fry its circuits. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Carter nodded. We'll need to set up EMP generators at key points around the facility. Synchronize them to go off simultaneously. If we can disrupt its neural network long enough, we might be able to contain it. The team sprang into action, a sense of urgency driving them forward. The air was thick with tension, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. They moved through the facility, setting up the generators, wiring them into the main power grid, and calibrating the timing sequences. Alex, we're almost ready, Patel said, her voice crackling through the comms. Generators are in place. Just need to run a final check. Carter made his way to the control room, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The organism was still out there, its presence a constant, malevolent weight pressing down on them. As he entered the room, he saw Patel hunched over the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. "Everything set?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Just about. We need to synchronize the generators to within a millisecond. Any delay and the feedback loop might not be strong enough." "Do it," Carter said, his voice firm. As Patel worked, Carter looked around at his team. They were exhausted, their faces lined with fear and determination. But there was a spark in their eyes, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. They were ready to fight back. "Generators synchronized," Patel said finally, leaning back in her chair. "We're ready." Carter took a deep breath. "All right, everyone. This is it. When those generators go off, we need to be ready to contain whatever's left. Stay sharp, stay focused. We're not losing anyone else." The team nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. Carter activated his comms. Initiating countdown. 10 seconds. The facility seemed to hold its breath as the countdown began. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. 5 seconds, Carter said, his voice steady. 4, 3, 2, 1, now. Patel hit the switch, and the facility was plunged into a momentary darkness. The generators hummed to life, their power building to a crescendo. Then, with a blinding flash, the MPs went off, sending a wave of energy through the facility. For a moment there was silence. Carter held his breath, his eyes fixed on the monitors. Then the screens flickered to life, showing the organism's neural network spasming, its connections breaking apart under the assault. "It's working," Patel said, her voice filled with cautious hope. "We're disrupting its network." But as the seconds ticked by, the organism began to fight back. Its tendrils lashed out, trying to re-establish connections to regain control. "Keep the generators running," Carter ordered. "We need more time." The team watched in tense silence as the battle played out on the screens. The organism's neural network was in chaos, but it was relentless, fighting to survive. "Come on," Carter muttered, his fists clenched. "Come on." Then, slowly, the organism's movements began to slow. Its tendrils retracted, its connections severing one by one. The neural network flickered, then went dark. "We did it," Patel whispered, a note of disbelief in her voice. "We actually did it." Carter allowed himself a moment of relief, but he knew the fight wasn't over. "Good work, everyone. But stay alert. We need to secure the facility and make sure there's nothing left." The team moved quickly, sweeping through the facility, searching for any remaining signs of the organism. The atmosphere was tense, every shadow a potential threat. But as the hours passed, it became clear that they had succeeded. "Facility is secure," Patel reported, her voice weary but triumphant. "No signs of the organism." Carter felt a weight lift off his shoulders. They had done it. They had fought back and won. But as he looked around at his exhausted team, he knew they couldn't let their guard down. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "We need to prepare for the next wave. But for now, let's take a moment to breathe. We've earned it." As they settled into an uneasy calm, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And as he looked out into the darkened corridors of the facility, he knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. The organism was relentless, and they had to be just as determined to survive. The air in the facility was heavy with the scent of burnt circuitry and ozone. Dr. Alex Carter stood in the central lab, the hum of the still active EMP generators a constant reminder of their precarious victory. The organism's neural network had been disrupted, but the cost had been high, and the battle was far from over. "Alex, we've detected residual activity in the lower levels." Patel's voice came through the comms, a note of exhaustion and determination in her tone. "It's weak, but it's still there." Carter's jaw tightened. They had crippled the organism, but it was not yet defeated. "Gather the team," he replied. "We're going to finish this." The corridors of the facility felt like the inside of a tomb. The emergency lighting cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Carter led the way, his steps sure and purposeful despite the fatigue that gnawed at his bones. They reached the lower levels, a place that had always felt colder, more isolated. The air was thick with tension, each breath a reminder of the stakes. The team moved in formation, weapons and containment tools at the ready. "Stay sharp," Carter whispered, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallways. "It's weak, but it's still dangerous." As they advanced, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the distant drip of water. They approached the main containment chamber, the place where it had all begun. The doors were slightly ajar, a subtle indication that something still lurked within. "Ready?" Carter asked, looking back at his team. Patel nodded, her face set in grim determination. Carter pushed the doors open, the metallic creak echoing ominously. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the flickering monitors that displayed the last remnants of the organism's activity. There, Patel pointed, her voice barely a whisper. "In the containment field." In the center of the room, the organism pulsed weakly, its tendrils flickering with a dim, erratic light. It was a shadow of its former self, but still undeniably alive. "We need to contain it, once and for all," Carter said, his voice steady. "Patel, initiate the containment protocol. Morris, be ready with the neutralizer." As Patel moved to the control panel, Carter and Morris advanced on the organism. The air seemed to thrum with a malevolent energy, a last-ditch effort from the creature to survive. Carter could feel its awareness, its desperation. "Containment protocol initiated," Patel announced, her fingers flying over the controls. "Activating the neutralizer in 3, 2, 1. Morris fired the neutralizer, a high-intensity beam designed to disrupt the organism's cellular structure. The beam hit the creature, and it writhed in agony, its tendrils flailing wildly. The room was filled with a high-pitched screech, a sound that seemed to pierce through their very souls. "Keep it steady," Carter shouted over the noise. "We can't let it escape." The organism's movements grew more frantic, its pulsing light flickering faster. Carter could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were on the brink of victory or disaster. "Almost there," Patel said, her voice strained with effort. "The neutralizer is working. It's destabilizing." Suddenly the organism surged, a last, desperate attempt to break free. Tendrils lashed out, striking at the containment field, sending sparks flying. The room shook with the force of the attack, and Carter felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Hold the line," he yelled, his voice filled with resolve. "We're almost there." With a final, agonizing screech, the organism's light flickered one last time and then went dark. The tendrils fell limp, the room falling into an eerie silence. "Is it over?" Morris asked, his voice a mix of hope and exhaustion. Carter stepped forward, his heart pounding. He scanned the monitors, looking for any sign of residual activity. The screens were blank, the organism's presence finally extinguished. "It's over," he said, a wave of relief washing over him. "We did it." The team let out a collective breath, the tension in the room easing. They had faced the unimaginable and emerged victorious. But as they stood in the aftermath, the reality of their situation began to set in. "We need to secure the facility," Carter said, his voice firm. "Make sure there's nothing left. And then we need to get this data out. The world needs to know what we faced here." Patel nodded, her expression one of determination. "We'll make sure of it, Alex. We'll make sure everyone knows." As they worked to secure the facility and gather the data, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The organism had been a warning, a precursor to something far worse. But for now, they had won a crucial victory. And as they emerged from the darkness of the facility, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Carter allowed himself a moment of hope. They had faced the abyss and survived, and whatever came next, they would be ready. The fight was far from over, but they had taken a stand. And in the quiet aftermath of their victory, Carter knew they had shown the world and themselves that they could fight back against the darkness. The facility lay in ruins. The once sterile halls were now littered with debris and the remnants of a battle hard fought. Dr. Alex Carter stood amidst the wreckage, his body aching with exhaustion. The organism had been neutralized, but the cost was etched into every broken piece of equipment and every silent, empty corridor. "Casualty report," Carter said, his voice hollow as he addressed the remaining team members who gathered around the central console. Patel looked up, her face a mask of grief and fatigue. "We lost 10. Another 15 are in critical condition. The rest. They're stable but shaken." Carter nodded, the weight of the losses pressing down on him. "We did what we had to do. The organism is gone. It won't harm anyone else." The words felt hollow, a weak balm against the reality of their situation. The team had faced an unimaginable horror, and while they had won, the victory was tainted by the lives lost and the lingering dread of what might come next. "We need to get a message out," Carter said, his voice firmer now. "The world needs to know what happened here. They need to be prepared." Patel nodded, her fingers moving over the console to initiate the transmission. The screens flickered to life, displaying the data they had collected, the recordings of their battle, and the genetic code of the organism. As the transmission went out, Carter looked around at his team. They were a ragtag group, their faces lined with exhaustion and sorrow, but there was a glimmer of determination in their eyes. They had survived, and that meant something. "Alex," Patel said, drawing his attention back to the console. "The transmission is sent. Now we just need to wait for a response." Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And hope they believe us. Hope they understand the threat." The facility was quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the remaining functional equipment and the distant groans of the structure settling after the battle. Carter moved through the corridors, checking on the injured and offering words of comfort where he could. In the medbay, he found Dr. Morris sitting beside one of the critically injured technicians, a look of deep sorrow on his face. "How's she doing?" Carter asked softly. Morris shook his head. "Not good. We're doing what we can, but—" Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did everything we could. You did everything you could." Morris looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of grief and determination. "We can't let this happen again, Alex. We need to be ready." "We will be," Carter said, a fierce resolve in his voice. "We've faced the worst of it, and we survived. We'll learn from this. We'll be stronger for it." The hours passed slowly, the team working to secure the facility and ensure that no traces of the organism remained. The weight of their losses hung heavily in the air, but there was also a sense of grim satisfaction. They had fought back and won, and that victory, however costly, was a testament to their resilience. As night fell, the facility's power flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. Carter stood in the control room, staring at the screens that showed the now empty containment chamber, where the organism had once pulsed with malevolent life. "We've sent the message," Patel said, joining him. "Now we wait." Carter nodded. "And we prepare. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Patel looked at him, her eyes reflecting the same resolve. "We'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we'll be ready." Carter turned to face her, a small, tired smile on his lips. "We have to be. For everyone who didn't make it, and for everyone out there who's counting on us. As they stood together in the dim light of the control room, the facility around them settling into an uneasy silence, Carter felt a sense of peace. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side. And while the future was uncertain, he knew they would face it together, ready for whatever came next. The night stretched on, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos of the battle they had fought. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Carter allowed himself a moment of hope. They had survived, and they would continue to fight. For now, that was enough. The facility was eerily silent, the calm after the storm. Dr. Alex Carter stood in the central control room, staring at the bank of monitors that displayed the now dormant sections of the lab. The organism was gone, its malevolent presence finally extinguished. But the silence was unnerving, a reminder of the cost of their victory. "Alex, we've got a situation," Patel's voice crackled through the comms, breaking the uneasy quiet. Carter's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "We're getting some strange readings from the lower levels," Patel said, her voice tense. "Residual energy spikes. It's not consistent with the organism's patterns, but it's definitely something." A cold dread settled in Carter's stomach. "Show me." Patel patched the feed through to his monitor. Carter's eyes widened as he saw the data fluctuating energy levels, anomalous signals that defied explanation. "It's not the organism," Patel continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But whatever it is, it's alive. And it's growing." Carter clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had barely survived the first threat, and now this? We need to investigate. Get a team together. The corridors felt darker, more oppressive, as they descended into the lower levels. The emergency lighting cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance mockingly along the walls. Carter led the way, his jaw set in grim determination. Patel, Morris, and a few remaining technicians followed closely, their faces pale but resolute. They reached the source of the readings, an old, unused section of the facility that had been sealed off for years. The door was covered in dust, the control panel inactive. "How is this possible?" Patel whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "This area hasn't been accessed in decades." Carter activated the control panel, overriding the security protocols. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, cavernous room. The air inside was cold, stale, and filled with a faint, otherworldly glow. "Stay close," Carter ordered, stepping inside. The team followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they moved deeper into the room, the source of the energy readings became clear. In the center of the room, suspended in a containment field, was a pulsating, alien structure. It was unlike anything they had seen before, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change. "What the hell is that?" Morris muttered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. Carter approached the containment field, his eyes fixed on the alien structure. "This must be what the organism was protecting," he said, his voice hushed. "A beacon, a signal. Or a seed." Patel's eyes widened in realization. "It's a signal. A call for reinforcements." As if in response to her words, the structure began to pulse more rapidly, emitting a low, resonant hum. The air grew thicker, the light more intense. "We need to shut it down," Carter said urgently. "If this thing sends out a signal." Before he could finish, the containment field flickered and then failed, the alien structure surging with energy. Tendrils of light lashed out, striking the walls and ceiling, sending sparks flying. "Get back," Carter shouted, pushing the team towards the exit. The room shook, debris falling around them as they scrambled to escape. They burst through the door, sealing it behind them just as a powerful shock wave rocked the facility. Carter leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. "That was too close," Patel gasped, her face pale. "What now?" Carter took a deep breath, his mind racing. We need to send a warning. Whatever that thing is, it's a signal to something out there. We have to be ready. As they made their way back to the control room, the sense of unease grew. They had survived the organism, but this new threat was something far more sinister, far more intelligent. Alex Patel said quietly, "What if this is just the beginning?" Carter looked at her, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "Then we fight. We prepare for whatever's coming. We don't have a choice." The facility was a fragile beacon of hope in a universe that seemed increasingly hostile. And as the team worked to send out their warning, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much larger, much more dangerous. The monitors flickered with static, the emergency lights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. The first wave had been a test, a prelude. And whatever was coming next, they had to be ready. Carter stared at the screens, his mind filled with a mix of fear and determination. The battle was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. And as the facility settled into an uneasy silence, the alien structure pulsed in the darkness, a beacon calling out into the void, summoning the next wave of horrors that would test the very limits of their endurance. The end was not in sight. It was just the beginning.